Welcome to Global Voices podcast. On this new episode, we will be discussing about the social economic implications of the lockdown. And for this, we're having with us two Indian professors that will be explain us these dynamics.
It's easy to get lost in theory and in future utopian or dystopian scenarios, but COVID-19 is already causing at the moment some very real and practical problems around the issue of food security. All over the world, harvests are in a state of precarity because the workers that global food supply chains depend on are affected in many different ways by lockdown measures and other problems caused by the outbreak of the global pandemic. It becomes really clear all of a sudden that many of the problems that we take for granted are in fact dependent on many factors that are vulnerable to the impacts of a state of unexpected crisis. Today we have with us Professor Ramakumar from Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai, India, and Mohan Rao, Professor Emeritus at the Department of Economics at the College of Social and Behavioral Science of the University of Massachusetts in the United States. They will provide us insights on and discuss the socioeconomic implications of the lockdown on a local, regional, and global level. Food is just one of the issues affected, but since it is among the most essential aspects of what maintains society and the economy, we will start with a focus on global food supply chains and different challenges to agriculture around the world. But before that, we would like to hear some introduction statements from our guests, and they will share with us their initial thoughts and points about the socioeconomic and possibly also political and epidemiological concerns in light of the pandemic. Mr. Rao, you're welcome to start. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sasha. I'm very happy to be here. I may not get into the question of food security per se immediately. I thought I would kind of give you a broad idea of the issues that the COVID crisis has thrown up, in particular for the case of India. What I will do is to highlight the economic problems that COVID poses, relate them to some specific aspects of India's economy, its economic structure, and also connect up that presentation or discussion with the main public health policy alternatives that India confronts and the economic and epidemiological dilemmas that India in particular faces. To begin with, a few facts of the case might be helpful. The first COVID case showed up in India on the 30th of January. The extensive and nearly complete lockdown of the society and economy was called on the 24th of March. That's a full 7 weeks after the first case arrived on the scene. And those 7 weeks might have been used to prepare for the lockdown that eventually came, but evidently was not planned for. As of now, we have, India has about 15,000 infections or cases and about 488 deaths. The lockdown of 3 weeks started on the 24th of March and was increased by another 18 days to end on the 3rd of May. The lockdown has been effective in a certain sense because it has slowed the doubling time from 6 days to 8 days in the last 2 weeks. Also, the lockdown has been extremely strict. According to the Oxford Government Response Tracker, India got a top score of 100 for the strictness of the lockdown. So it's been a very strict and rigorous lockdown. There's also a proposal to have a graded system of relaxing the lockdown, particularly in the safe areas of the country. That all said, I must confess there is a great deal of uncertainty still about the future path of the disease itself, but also about what the state might be doing. But because the state has been acting without a well-announced plan in advance. Now, on the economic situation, but also on the COVID situation, I think there are 5 specific points which are very particular to the kind of discussion that we can have for India. To begin with, India has a very low COVID mortality up to now, for which the objective reasons include, first of all, that the country is relatively young. 91% of the population are less than 60 years old, say compared to 75% in the Italian case. Secondly, there is some evidence which suggests that anti-TB vaccination in childhood or later, called BCG, is helpful. And we do have very good coverage from BCG in India. Thirdly, as I already mentioned, the shutdown has been very strict, and that may have had an effect also on the number of cases and therefore on mortalities. And finally, the weather has been warming, particularly the last few weeks in India, and it'll get only warmer over the coming couple months. So that kind of accounts for the low COVID mortality, which is, as I said, extraordinarily low. But when it's taken together with the extraordinarily low rate of infection, in fact, India has among the lowest rates of infection globally and a very low R0 value, then perhaps the low COVID mortality could be explained by that route as well. Now, the lockdown itself, or any kind of significant distancing program, could have been anticipated to have very grave consequences in the Indian condition. The primary reason is that India has very poor safety nets. Of course, India is a very poor country with a great deal of people, great deal of the proportion of the population, about 70%, beneath, let's say, $2 a day per person, rate of living standard. So there's a great deal of potential suffering that could be caused by a strict lockdown, and we have already seen quite a bit of that. Only about 15% of the workforce has either income security or pension security, and many people suffer from food insecurity, I should say. Roughly speaking, about 400 million of about 500 million workers in the country are in low-earning occupations in agriculture, in micro, small, and medium enterprises, or are employed as casual daily wage workers. So, that should give you a pretty good idea of the potential challenge that a strict lockdown or any kind of serious separation faces. This is worsened by another characteristic, which is very important, and that is the fact that India has a highly inadequate health system and very poor health services, hospitals, beds available per capita, accessibility of healthcare, the costs of healthcare, the private costs of healthcare, and a very, very low proportion of public health services available in the economy. India has one of the lowest spending ratios relative to GDP on health, 1.3%. And these vulnerabilities on the health system side have also shown up in the case of COVID itself, namely in the form of a very weak capacity for testing and treatment and very deficient availability of PPE, personal protective equipment, or ventilators and the like. Last but not the least, there was shockingly inadequate preparation before the 24th March lockdown. In fact, the lockdown took place after a trial lockdown 2 days earlier, and the actual lockdown was announced with just 4 hours of notice, which caused considerable disarray in the population because many people, particularly the migrant laborers, the day laborers, there are about 150, 180 million migrant workers, mostly from the rural areas, who live in urban areas, who suddenly found themselves without incomes, without employment. Their employers had essentially asked them to leave. Perhaps even without a home in many cases, because they had very flimsy, ramshackle accommodations shared with many, many people, possibly without a kitchen, and therefore they were suddenly without amenities of being able to live, even for 24 hours. So many of them really found themselves completely displaced, and they sought to get back to their homes, and this produced a lot of confusion, because in the name of distancing, we ended up seeing a lot of close at hand interactions and crowding at train stations, bus stations, and the like. Another point to remember is that India is a very unequal country. Economically speaking, India is one of the most unequal countries in the world. It's not only a poor country, but a very unequal country. So that should give you some idea of the extent of poverty that exists in the country, lack of access to basic material living standard. And some significant part of the urban population, perhaps of the order of 15 or 20% of the urban population, are able to stay at home and work in place. But these are the privileged people. They have incomes. They probably have not lost employment, many of them, perhaps most of them. They are able, in fact, to continue working. So there is probably no question of losing employment in many cases. They have their own private access to pensions and source of security. And therefore, they are hardly afflicted other than the modest inconveniences of staying in place. In comparison, the vast rest of the population have been very badly afflicted. As I said, physically, psychologically, residentially, locationally, and from being far away from their families and so on, very badly indeed. The elderly are also discomfited in a very serious way. The challenge has been particularly great for elderly people, because they're of course living in very crowded households and very crowded neighborhoods in urban areas, particularly urban areas, but not very much better in rural areas. But also the Indian family structure is typically multi-generational, so very young and middle-aged and very old people often live together. So that poses an additional threat. So the upshot of the sudden clampdown of the distancing requirement was a rapid rise in food insecurity in the country. There were visible signs of this in many parts of the country. It took a little while for the government or governments, because that includes state governments, to get their acts together to arrange for what might be called soup kitchens or feeding temporary shelters. Instead, what we saw was widespread and instantaneous pauperization of the population, homelessness, and displacement. So clearly, much needs to be done in the very short run, by which I mean the next week, the next few weeks, a couple of months, and much more needs to be done in the long run if India is not to confront another challenge, which, by the way, could come as quickly as a few months from now, just in case there is a second wave of COVID itself. But also, of course, the possibility, indeed the probability, that there might be a return of similar epidemics or pandemics in the not too distant future, unless both India and humanity in general somehow learn to reform their ways and take care of many of the issues, many of the weaknesses that have been exposed by COVID. So yes, so much needs to be done. Much will also have to be done in the longer run of a couple to 5 years. But I should also like to note that the government has been very kind in its words, paying a lot of lip service to the conditions and suffering of the poor. But in actual fact, public action seems to have been lacking in commitment and even thoughtfulness for the well-being of the mass of the population. So that is something that is extremely worrisome going forward. Already it has created, as I said, considerable hardship. At the same time, I would like to note that the public space, the public sphere, the public neighborhood, the media and the TV channels, and the social media in particular, have become arenas of intense discrimination against the minorities in India. And these public areas and arenas are also running very low on any genuine feeling of solidarity or fellow feeling, unless it is driven by sectarian beliefs, including religious beliefs. So this is also extremely worrisome, both because in the short run itself, it could create considerable difficulties for implementing social protection, social security programs, and so on, including feeding the masses, but also because it can come in the way of the government acting sensibly in taking care of the medium-term and long-term problems.
So, you have something else, Rao?
Yes, maybe we can return to this, but I would like to close with a remark or two about a possible, the possible relevance of a discussion that has taken place in many other countries too, which is the relationship between the economic dilemmas that I've just mentioned, the extreme short-run cost of a lockdown, if that is the solution that is chosen, versus the possibility of what has been described as building up herd immunity. So flattening the curve of infections and mortality, which is really what the lockdown is supposed to do and more or less does, is not assured to produce immunity of the population to future waves or clusters or spreads of the disease, even after it seems to have subsided. This has happened, for example, in the case of Singapore recently. So this is something to worry about. And what this might mean for the public health strategy is one issue that I would like to flag, although I myself, I'm no expert in this area and therefore would not hazard too much speculation about what might be done or what should be done. But I am concerned about this area because, of course, it has a direct relevance for the economic choices and policies one might adopt. And one last issue I would like to flag is the government seems to have shown considerable hesitancy to open up its purse and to spend immediately on a large scale, as is required by the crises that have beset the country. So that is also very worrisome to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rao, for your intervention. So now, Professor Ramakumar, we want to know what you think about the situation.
Okay, thank you. It's very helpful to speak after a veteran like Professor Rao, because he always sets the context and you can walk straight into what you want to speak on. As Professor Rao mentioned at some point in his presentation, this is a crisis which has not quite happened in the past. This is a very unique crisis. it is unique because it is a crisis where both the supply and the demand fall together in some sense. We always, the past had problems with demand shortfall, problems with supply shocks, or we had problems that emanate in the financial sector due to speculation, etc., which spill over into the real economy. But this is a crisis where both demand and supply have fallen together. The second feature of this crisis is that if you look at what we call as an economic curve, and an epidemic curve, and put both together, you would actually see that there is strong inverse relationship between the two. As the epidemic curve, if you just plot the cumulative numbers in a graph, as the epidemic graph goes up, the economic graph has to, in some sense, go down. Otherwise, if you want to tie down the epidemic curve, you need things like lockdown and so on, and then that will actually pull down the economic curve. And the more the epidemic curve goes up, the more the economic curve has to go down. So there is a dilemma here, which is that if you want to restart the economy in some sense, you need to, as is usually said, flatten the curve. Not just flatten the curve, but also just pull it down. You need to beat it down and not just flatten it in some sense. So that's something that is very unique about this crisis. If you come to the question of food security, which is what we are dealing with today, I would like to deal with this question in terms of three questions and trying to answer them in some sense. The first is that does the world have enough food to feed its people? And so does India. Second is, I would like to ask what is happening to food prices, because it is when food prices increase rapidly that you see people losing access to food. This has happened in the past cases of epidemics as well, like the Ebola or the other epidemics that we have seen in the more recent past. The third question that I would like to ask is what is happening to farmers in this crisis? And along with that, I will add, after trying to answer these three questions, I would like to add what is happening to informal sector workers, particularly particularly migrant workers and their food security. And I would sort of try to answer them together in a short span of time. If you look at the world, you will see that it would appear, I'm trying to answer the first question, do we have enough food stocks? If you look at the global situation, you will see that the world appears to have enough food stock. That is, it has about 861 million tons of cereals as on 2nd April. Now, if you calculate a small ratio as the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, does, which is to calculate a stock to use ratio. That is, how much of the total consumption do we have as stocks at this point of time? For cereals, this happens to be around 31%. That is, 31% of the consumption is available as stocks today. FAO calls it a comfortable level of stock at this point of time. If you take wheat, rice, etc., the similar ratios are about 35-36%. That's where we are with respect to stock to use ratio. But the problem in looking at this stock to use ratio is that global stocks of this sort are not the same as national stocks. National stocks can be very different from global stocks, because if you see the case of wheat in the world, 52% of the total wheat stock in the world is held by one country, China. 20% of the world rice stock is held by one country, India. So if countries like this begin to turn precautionary and they stop trading in the world markets, then that would mean that national stocks would not be adequate to feed the respective populations. This has already begun to happen in some sense. Kazakhstan, which is a major wheat importer, has stopped its exports of wheat. Russia is trying to bring in some quota system to trade its wheat. It's the world's largest wheat exporter. Thailand, world's third largest rice exporter, is actually has already stopped its exports. So basically, we have country after country turning precautionary and not trading. If that prolongs for a long period of time, many countries who have actually food grains to feed their population only for a month or month and a half or 2 months will be in trouble if the lockdown proceeds beyond that time. So that's a very important feature of food security around us. Countries which do not have adequate stocks of feed, of food grain, will actually be in trouble if the lockdown prolongs beyond a month or month and a half. Now, if you come to India, India also is you look like it is in a safe position with respect to food stocks at the national level. We have about 292 million tons of food grains coming in 1920, and if you look at 1st March of 2020, the total stocks of food grains that we had with the Food Corporation of India was something like 77 million tons. This is at a time when the official norm for buffer stocks says we need only about 21 million tons. So we need about 21 million tons in stock at this time, according to our norms, but we have about 77 million tons of grains. So we have about 4 times the officially specified norm of food stock in the country. More harvest is going to come in because the Rabi crop, the second crop, is being harvested, the winter crop, and it's going to come into the market now, and it will further bolster the reserves of food in India. Now, so it appears that if you look at food stock as a whole, we are in a good position. Now, the problem in this will emerge when I discuss the second question, which is what is happening to food prices. Because if food prices are rising, as you should expect in such a pandemic, because people will be going on panic buying and so on and so forth, then you will be in trouble because food prices will rise sharply. But the pandemic has another feature, which is also that demand falls. So what is happening to prices in this kind of a situation? If you look at the prices, if you look at world food prices, the FAO will tell you that world food prices are falling rapidly, or have fallen rapidly. It computes what is called as the World Food Price Index. It also computes what is called as the World Cereal Price Index. Both have fallen between February 2020 and March 2020. April figures are awaited. According to FAO, there are 2 reasons for why prices have fallen in many countries. One is, of course, demand for food is coming down very quickly. People have lost jobs, people have lost wages, and there is not enough money that is available to buy food with large numbers of people. So people have reduced the food consumption, and hence there is less demand for food today than before. The second FAO says is because there is a sharp decline in the price of one crop, which is called maize, because it is an ingredient in biofuel preparation production. And because in large parts of the United States and all, for example, people are not driving, and also there is less demand for also because oil prices have fallen very sharply globally, and people are now able to substitute for oil in the place of biofuels. Ethanol prices have fallen rapidly. So because ethanol prices have fallen rapidly, maize prices or corn prices have also fallen rapidly. Now, these 2 are cited as the reasons by FAO for this price fall at the global level. Now, if you look at India, before coming to India, if you look at these Western countries itself, you will actually see that, however, even if the FAO says there is some amount of decline in demand for food and so on, you still do see impacts of panic buying and hoarding, stockpiling by households across the board, particularly in rice, wheat, eggs, meat, etc. All these are very important issues that have come up, and in the United States, for example, studies note or observers have noted that slowly the prices of certain food commodities have been rising because of panic buying and absence of stock in the market. It is exacerbated by another feature. For example, in one of the largest meat plants in the United States. United States is a country where around 50 meat plants cater to 98% of the demand of meat in that country. So there is this recent incident where meat plants have been closed because workers have tested positive for COVID, and this has resulted in meat prices going up again. So slowly we are moving into a situation where food prices appear to be rising, even though certain food prices appear to be rising, even though demand is also falling. That's the global situation that we have. So it's a mixed picture, but we do see signs of falling demand for food, as well as strong disruptions in the supply of certain goods, like meat, for example. If you come to India, you will see a similar trend. The wholesale price index and the consumer price index for February 2020 and March 2020 will show that India has had falling food inflation rates during this period, falling food price indices in this time. This again, one of the biggest falls have been for vegetables. The consumer price index has really fallen very sharply between February and March. Now, this means that the demand for vegetables in particular and food broadly has sharply fallen in India as well, as FAO says for the world. I'll give you two examples here. One is the large, I live in the city of Mumbai, and Mumbai is catered by a large wholesale market just outside its border in a place called Vashi, which is called the APMC Vashi. The Agricultural Produce Marketing Committee has a large regulated market there. Around 800 trucks used to arrive with food items every day to that APMC market before the lockdown began. After the lockdown began, only about 100 to 150 trucks have been coming to that secondary, that wholesale market after the lockdown. This, however, has not meant that food prices have increased. Even though only 150 trucks arrive in the place of 800 trucks, food prices have actually been stable in the market. This means that there is a sharp fall in demand for commodities in that market. I speak to my vegetable vendor. I don't usually give anecdotes, but just for this occasion, I spoke to my vegetable vendor. I speak to him every week. He says that every day he used to do a business of 4,000 rupees in his retail shop, but and he used to get about 600 rupees takeaway from that turnover. But after the lockdown began, the sales have come down from 4,000 rupees to 1,500 rupees per day, and he gets to take home only about 100 or 150 only. So this means that there is quite a bit of evidence that we have that food consumption has fallen very sharply in large parts of India, and that is one reason why food prices appear to be falling in many places, even though you would expect it to rise because of panic buying, stockpiling, etc. Now, this what I'm trying to say is there's large extents of large numbers of hungry people around us, people who are actually hungry and also malnourished as a result in large parts of India during the period of the lockdown. That is very important to understand when we look at food prices. Now, the third question that I come to is related to farmers. Now, farmers have been affected very badly during this lockdown. This is the time when farmers were harvesting their second crop, the winter crop of Rabi. There were disruptions in the procurement of food grains by government agencies during this time, because they had harvested their crop, but then no procurement agency was coming to pick them up. There were disruptions in the collection of harvest by usual private traders that you would usually come and pick up the grains, because they did not have, for example, enough number of trucks to bring for procurement. If trucks were available, Truck drivers were not available because truck drivers are usually migrant workers and they have gone home during this lockdown. So yeah, if trucks are sometimes trucks are not available. If trucks are available, truck drivers are not available. If truck and driver both are available and they have gone to drop a product at some place and they are supposed to come back to pick up the next load, they don't come back because they get stuck in a highway by some policeman, and they there are about 500,000 trucks which are supposed to be stuck in different parts of Indian highways due to their inability to cross state borders and come back to their destination, reach their destination or come back to the origin after dropping goods at the destination. So supply schedules have been thoroughly disrupted as a result of this. There also have been limited operations of these markets that I mentioned. I'll give you the example of the Vashi APMC market in Mumbai. I must say that the market is shut down now. It used to work, but it is shut down now after a trader tested positive for the COVID-19 virus. And as a result, the whole APMC market, which used to cater to the wholesale market, which used to cater to the needs of Mumbai, is now completely shut down. Not even a day's operation currently. Similarly, the nearby city of Pune, which is again a very large city with large number of informal sector workers, companies, factories, and so on. There again, the most important wholesale market, the APMC Pune, has closed down because another trader tested positive there. As a result, there are closure of APMC, that is wholesale markets. There are also crises in retail markets. Retail markets have been shut down in many places. So farmers are facing this huge problem of not being able to sell their commodities in the market. If you see some examples of how prices have fallen, tomato growers in the state where I live, Maharashtra, were receiving only rupees 2 per kg for their produce. And it is said that grape growers in Maharashtra are facing at a 1,000 crore loss during this period because there is no export of wine, and also there is no grape being processed in wine factories. Wheat prices in the nearby state of Madhya Pradesh have fallen from about 2,200 rupees per quintal to about 1,600 rupees per quintal. Vegetable prices in Punjab are supposed to have fallen from 15 rupees per kg to about 1 rupees per kg. In Delhi, the price of broiler chicken fell from about 55 rupees per kg in January to about 24 rupees per kg in March. If you look at Tamil Nadu, another example, egg prices fell from rupees 4 per egg to about 2 rupees per egg. So these are the kinds of falls that you have seen in the prices of commodities across the board. As a result, there is a huge adverse impact on farmers' incomes, particularly during the period of lockdown. Farmers are also affected by another problem, which is the absence of migrant labor. The harvest of many crops require migrant labor. Our agricultural system has been so dependent on migrant labor, and their importance has been so much less understood that it is when these migrant workers disappeared that you realize their value suddenly. I'm reminded of a movie that I saw in 2004, which was called A Day Without a Mexican, where the movie is about, it's not a movie, it's a mockumentary in some sense. It's about what happens if all the Mexicans disappear in California one fine morning. Streets are left unclean, clothes are not washed, the whole place is dirty, and suddenly people realize the value of the migrant workers. So this migrant worker class has also been severely affected during this period. You see in different places slowly the eruption of protests among migrant workers because they are not getting enough food to eat. The government has declared that food will be distributed through the public distribution outlets, but not enough food is available on the ground. So they have been protesting in large numbers, flouting social distancing measures, and they have been on the streets off and on. So basically, I'll try to slowly wrap up my point, which is that if you look at three questions that I asked, that is, what is happening to food stock, what is happening to food prices, and what is happening to farmers. There are the stocks appear to be enough for a short period of time, but that does not mean that people are eating adequate amounts of food, because food security has been adversely affected by very less demand for food and resultant less consumption of food in rural and urban areas, particularly among informal, unorganized migrant workers. This is the time when government should universalize its public distribution system. However, the government has not universalized the public distribution system. It has continued to keep it targeted, and that has been one important problem that we have been having in food distribution and consumption over the last few weeks of the lockdown. I will close my initial remarks there. I look forward to the interactive session that would follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ramakumar. Now I want to know about some specific cases, like for example the Mexican Latin American people in their relations with the production in the United States, since they are migrants and are the workforce of the country. How are they affected, and how is the production in USA being affected by the low amount of workforce?
I haven't heard too much about this, and even if there is, I cannot imagine that this will have an immediately large effect on the market for a wide range of food commodities. Because remember, what it might do is raise the price of farm labor and therefore put up the prices of farm products, if that. But then the price of farm products is not a very large fraction of the total price of food in an advanced country, because all the processing, transport, and distribution margins absorb a very large part of the final price of food. To some extent, this is true also in poorer countries, but much less so. The PTD margin, as it's called, the processing, transport, and distribution margin, tends to be much larger in the advanced countries. But what is happening to the migrants themselves? Yes, that is a very serious question. Probably what is happening to migrants into the United States from Mexico and other parts of Latin America, who are already here, that is. Of course, migration has practically completely been stopped into the United States right now. But the migrants who are already here are probably in somewhat the same plight as are Indian workers, Indian day laborers, Indian self-employed people. In short, the vast majority of Indian workers, 70, 80% of the labor force, are roughly in a similar situation, with a very important caveat that in India, we do have a public distribution system which provides a certain amount of shelter against the open market for food. And as part of the lockdown, the government also has made a slightly larger allowance of food grain than is customary. None of this, of course, is available to the Mexican migrants or Latin American migrants into the United States. So I think American food consumers are likely to suffer very much less in terms of food price rises, at least for the foreseeable future, than American, particularly immigrant farm workers are likely to suffer, because they are going to suffer a decline in their incomes, hounding by police in many parts of the country, because police are taking a very tough stand. And as a consequence, they may have to hide or basically disappear from the workplaces. And this will have an immediate impact on their purchasing power for everything, because their incomes will decline or vanish, but especially for food. Unfortunately, I have not read any direct stories in this regard in the American case, but that is, while slightly speculative, I think a reasonably correct expectations. Now, just to supplement what I'm saying right now, and to what Ramakumar closed his discussion on the food situation in India with, that is the question of accessibility of food. Ramakumar has given us a very detailed picture of the supply situation in regard to food, the stock situation in India, and what has been happening to prices. Although the stock and supply situation look reasonably good at this time of the year, the price situation, is cause for concern because the price situation can quickly worsen if certain other shocks appear on the scene, either on the consumption side or on the government policy side. Having said that, really the crucial point to note is that the supply or the stock situation is very comfortable in India. Therefore, the right thing for the government to do is to immediately, without further hesitation, universalize the public distribution system. The problem is something like 100 million Indians do not have what the governments might consider to be legitimate access to the public distribution system. That is the right paperwork and the like. To go through proper bureaucratic channels and provide them with the required paper would take much too much time and bureaucratic hassle, and the workers are hardly in a position to be chasing after permits and papers from the government servants, from the government bureaucrats. Therefore, I think it is absolutely necessary as soon as possible that the government universalize the public distribution system. This would be the number one requirement, I think, on the poor social safety nets that we have in the country. The second point is that as and when relaxation of the lockdown takes place, and mind you, a certain amount of relaxation has already taken place as far as the rural sector is concerned. Therefore, then the second thing that the government can do is to immediately open up the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which has essentially been shut down for the sake of the lockdown. Because by the way, that's a long name of the program, so I'm going to shorten it. It's called Manrega by many people. I repeat, that's the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. So the government should immediately open up Manrega so that people have access to employment, particularly in infrastructure building and the like, and therefore they can have immediate access to ready cash. Because as I pointed out earlier in my initial presentation, what has happened with the lockdown is that a great bulk of the ordinary working classes in India, particularly rural areas, but also the very large migrant population, have lost immediate access to cash earnings. And while some ministers in the government have asked the quite ludicrous question as to whether people need more than food in the current situation, the fact of the matter is, of course they do. And if they don't have cash, then they're going to be bereft of purchasing power to meet those very essential requirements. So it's very important, therefore, in addition to universalizing the public distribution system, that the government should immediately open up Manrega employment schemes. Last but not the least, the third item, which is on the agenda that I think is extremely important, is that the government should make sure that the provisioning of food and cereals is planned, not left to the marketplace. As Ram also pointed out earlier, this is an unusual crisis. Any country undergoing shutdown because of COVID faces an unusual economic crisis because it is both a demand insufficiency and a supply inefficiency. It's a demand inefficiency because people have lost purchasing power. They don't have money. This has even happened in the United States because the US is not a welfare system like, let's say, Denmark or Holland or even Britain, where the government has stepped in and said that it would guarantee 80% of wages of all workers. So there is need to take care of the insufficiency of purchasing power, but at the same time, as long as the lockdown continues, significant parts of the production sectors of the economy will remain shut down. In fact, that's what shutdown means. So we need to have a tandem forward movement of both demand and supply. Simply giving more money to workers and others is not enough. That's very important, of course, as I just pointed out, but it won't be sufficient if you don't bring the goods to market, which will meet the demands that will appear once people actually have purchasing power in their hands. Now, because you have a shutdown situation, because many enterprises have already shut down, in fact, gone out of business in a country like India, and many enterprises which have not gone out of business have shut down production, to bring them back onto active production will require some kind of relaxations of the lockdown itself, or failing which government has to mobilize in a planned fashion, in a controlled fashion, the release of production. In other words, in effect, a partial government takeover of the production economy, so that that production comes to the market. And think about what's happening to the healthcare sector. In many parts of the world, there is both a private care sector and a public healthcare sector. In Spain, early on, the government decided to completely take over, meaning nationalize the private healthcare sector. This has not happened in India. I read reports of many hospitals in the private sector not being pressed into service. So this is the third general point I would like to make. As long as the shutdown is on, the lockdown is on, which is till the 3rd of May, which is already still another 2 weeks away, it's important that the government take immediate steps to make sure that provisioning or programming, or to use an old-fashioned word, planning for the supplies of essential goods in addition to food is also put into place. That is my third important consideration of a policy recommendation for the current situation. Thank you.
I just wanted to supplement the points that Professor Rao made so well. What I meant by my remark on Mexicans was that, if you look at the United States, it has about 2.5 million farm workers as a whole. And more than half of them are actually immigrants with no work authorization. How they're, instead of being harassed by the police, and they're actually hiding. But even this is sometimes not sufficient during this time when once the winter ends, you move from California to the central parts where there's more strawberry and those high value vegetables being grown. There you need a lot of migrant labor to do the harvesting operations and other farming operations. Usually what the United States does, it brings in workers on a temporary visa from Mexico and other parts, which is called the H-2A visa. Now, what Trump had said earlier was that he will actually reduce the number of H-2A visas to reduce the inflow of Mexicans into the United States. His own government actually gave more H-2A visas because it's a source of easy, cheap labor. In his time, he increased the number of H-2A visas from 130,000 to about 200,000 in about 4 years. So what has happened is, with coming, as Professor Rao said, they first shut down the borders. No workers will be allowed into the United States. That led to a lot of complaints from farmers. And finally, Trump, it would be relented and said, "We want to bring more workers. If we don't bring workers, we are not having any farmers in the country." Being from Mexico. Now, if you look at other countries as well, Europe has a shortage of about 1 million agricultural laborers at this time, because European cultivation of crops is heavily dependent in April, May, June, etc., on workers who migrate from Romania, Bulgaria, etc. There again, there is another serious problem because these workers were not being allowed to come into countries like Germany and so on. Finally, and a compromise have been found out, about 30,000 to 50,000 Romanian workers are being flown from airports like Cluj, CLUJ, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, in Romania, to Baden, Dusseldorf, Berlin, etc. Special flights are being arranged to bring seasonal farm workers from Bulgaria and Romania into Germany for this crop season. United Kingdom also has a similar problem of very less number of workers available. So first they put out a request that people who have lost jobs in other operations like catering jobs, restaurants, waiters, etc. Would you like to come and work in the farms? Because we need you. Now the unions of farmers in the United Kingdom have put out a demand for about some million pounds scheme to actually create land armies of laborers who would actually go from one place to another, harvest the crops of farmers, etc. So what I'm trying to say is there is a huge shortage of migrant labor, not just in India, but it's also a phenomenon that we see across the world. My point, these migrant workers are given low wages. They are subject to a lot of exploitation. They are given poor housing. They are not given insurance. They are not given even minimum wages. So my point with respect to migrant laborers was the following. They are inevitable for the production process in rural areas. Without them, rural production will collapse in many regions. Yet, they are poorly paid, treated with disdain, and denied multiple rights. In fact, the onset of COVID-19 has exposed the hypocrisy of different stakeholders, including large farmers, government, etc., in this regard. This this comes with the problem of food insecurity because because migrant workers are not able to work. They are not. They have lost their jobs as a result. No wages. And they have been victims of food insecurity and hunger as a result. So it's not a problem that you see in India. It's a problem that you see across rural areas of the world. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
So thank you for that. I think we can discern on a global level, whether we take the example from the US or from Europe or from India, a certain dynamic between classes in society. For example, when Mohan brought up the lack of proper paperwork for a certain subset of the population in India, or if we're talking about the work conditions and labor treatment and discrimination faced by many workers who are particularly vulnerable around the world, I think the concept I would like to propose and to the guests, if they are familiar with it, is the concept of the subaltern, which is Gramscian, but also Gayatri Spivak's question: can the subaltern speak? I think is becoming relevant because we are seeing a global class that is socioeconomically exploited or excluded. And at the same time, this class now is especially important because there's a dependence on these people. And so my question is there a certain emancipatory potential? And this is a question to Mohan. Is there a certain emancipatory potential in the current situation? Or is this just another capitalist crisis that will just cause more damage?
A capitalist crisis, but it is also a crisis of the relationship between human beings and nature, because the origins clearly of the crisis are in that interaction with nature. But of course, the crisis on the epidemiological side is being filtered through essentially a capitalist economy or a mixed economy, as in the Indian case. Now, the question you ask is, what happens to the subaltern classes? Is there an emancipatory potential in the crisis? Well, first of all, it's important to remember that the crisis itself has created a huge amount of fear and uncertainty. If you are poor, if you have lost your job, if you have lost your place of residence, as has happened to many, many people in India, and if you're far from your family and familiar surroundings of your own village, then the first feelings you have are fear. This fear has been actively exacerbated by government policies of hounding the workers into limited spaces or preventing them from moving on to their villages and the like. Similar amount of fear also exists, of course, in a country like the United States, but perhaps not quite the same scale, in part because the crisis is much graver in a country like India. So first there is fear, and that's the first response, and that is not a very fertile ground for people to rise up and protest and argue with the government and so on. But having said that, nonetheless, we see some glimmerings of this sort of protestation. You've seen some of that in the United States. Unfortunately, I'm not very sure that has emancipatory potential, because much of those protests that have taken place, for example, in Wisconsin or Michigan or elsewhere, have been from right-wing groups which I don't think have very much of the emancipatory potential for mankind on their minds. But in parts of India, in small parts of India, there have been short and small uprisings of particularly migrant workers faced with a situation where they would like to migrate back, migrate to their home villages, but the governments and the police have actively prevented them from doing so, and have sometimes even felt police violence, police batons on their backs and legs and so on. And this has prompted a certain amount of protest. So the subaltern has risen to some extent. There's a certain new consciousness that definitely exists, I'm sure, among the suffering masses. Now, whether this will translate anytime in the near future, or even more distant future, into larger scale action, larger scale organization, larger scale mobilization, and the like, one can discuss and debate, but one can have opposing viewpoints. And in this connection, I should like to mention the recent history of India, where divide and conquer has been a very durable part of the political landscape, particularly under the BJP government of the past 6 years. And that is where, what I mentioned earlier, the lack of solidarity with the minorities, with the subalterns, if you like, and in fact, active discrimination against Muslims in particular, but other minorities too, those work in the opposite direction. They cut in the opposite direction of emancipation. As you know, the first response of the ruling class everywhere, capitalism is no exception, is to divide and try to conquer that way when there is any sign of protest or even threat of protest or uprising on the part of the masses. So I'm hopeful, but I'm not exactly expecting that there will be, a solid move in that direction.
I think it's interesting that you bring up the concept divide and conquer, because I was going to ask about that just now when you brought it up, because I was going to observe that a pretty basic dynamic of how power is maintained historically is by dividing populations rather than allowing them to unite, because the only strength of the vulnerable working classes is in unity. That's the only way that they can exert any power. But if they unify, they can exert a huge amount of power. And so I was going to maybe ask Ramakumar, because your research focus is on migrant laborers particularly, and in agriculture also particularly. I was going to ask, what potential do you see for unionizing, maybe particularly nowadays with social media being in a lot of, at least not everyone's, but in a lot of workers' hands? Yeah, just take the question as you like.
Thanks for the question. In my view, what we can safely say is that there will be an intensification of class struggle in the coming days. One of the major demands of one of the big industry unions, industry confederations in India, which I saw in the newspapers yesterday, was that we should ban trade union activity for 1 year because of the COVID crisis. That is the demand that is officially coming from industry groups, that trade unionism and all forms of collective action should be banned for at least a year. In other words, what is going to happen is, in most economic packages that the countries have announced in different parts of the world, there are complaints that a disproportionate amount is going not to small and marginal enterprises or farmers. It is actually going to bail out big firms and companies. So when that happens, part of the public exchequer is being already transferred to these big companies. Their losses are being socialized in some form. Now, however, it turns out they are not happy with even that. They want to transfer another part of the burden on the workers' shoulders. That is why they're demanding things like no trade unions. This would mean that they're looking for a period after this lockdown ends, when wages are likely to fall. Some demands have already come, where the demand has been that you should increase the time of work in a day from 8 hours to 12 hours because of the COVID crisis and the problems that have come with it. So no trade unions, increased in the length of working hours, all these are likely to be demands of capitalists in the coming days. And worker unions, their activities are going to be discouraged by saying that, look, we have had such a big crisis, you guys should remain silent for a while. I think workers' unions will and should strike back with all their force against this brutality, against this monstrosity, if at all it happens. This is the time, in my view, for trade unions and workers' movements to push for and demand a comprehensive social security system in developing countries. In developed countries of Europe, etc., you have some kind of welfare state system out there. But in developing countries like India, you have absolutely no trace of a welfare state outside a little bit of food distribution and so on. So you basically have to, we basically have to see that this is the time to demand investment in public education. This is the time to demand investment in public health. This is the time to demand investment in social security assistance of different kinds, which are available in many the welfare state measures. So I don't see a very smooth future out here. Things are going to be very rough. Sailing is going to be very rough. There's going to be intensified class struggle, and none of us is going to predict it correctly. But my point is that we certainly are in for tumultuous times. It's not going to be a peaceful future that we are going to see. Workers are going to go ahead and demand their rights. There's going to be denial of that right in the name of the crisis, and there are likely to be depending on the situation in different countries, you will see different results, but it's not going to be a peaceful, smooth phase that you're going to see in the next few months. But I do hope that some kind of pro-people measures at least come out of this crisis. People realize that they have underinvested in health, underinvested in education. Look at the richest country in the world, the United States, it doesn't have adequate PPE, it doesn't have enough masks, it can't make masks. Lawrence Summers was wondering in the tweet, why is the richest country in the world not able to make enough masks for its own? The problem is the economic ideology that people like Summers himself pushed for all these years is primarily responsible for killing American manufacturing in many ways. So we have to understand that while even the richest countries have eroded their manufacturing systems and their health systems so much that when the pandemic struck, they were unable to provide people with even the basic necessities like face masks. That has to come from China, by the way, and you always call it a Chinese virus, nevertheless. Now, this means that there is a serious way in which we have dealt with our health and education systems and social security systems in the last 30 to 40 years of neoliberal policy. And I hope, in the least, that a correction happens in that, and a more pro-people, democratic, progressive vision of the society will emerge from this, and there will be movements there on the ground of workers, of farmers, of all kinds of working people, which will demand and push for it in the strongest possible terms.
Thank you, Professor. Mohan, you have anything else about this discussion?
To make a few remarks, on this set of issues concerning the class struggle and the class question and the subaltern question and related matters. To begin with, this point about Larry Summers wondering why sufficient masks have not been produced in a powerful economy such as the United States. A number of political leaders and commentators have talked about the COVID crisis as a warlike situation. But if you think about it, in almost any war, almost in any country, no matter what its ideology, a warlike situation usually begets a certain amount of government takeover of the economy and government planning. In fact, that is precisely the war powers that Trump refused to use in order to press American corporations to produce ventilators. If you will recall, he actively withheld using the war powers' rights to press corporations into service. But all wars require government action and a certain amount of planning. And the fact of the matter is, both in India and the United States, this line of thought has been assiduously avoided. The governments have actively avoided this, in part because these two countries, there may be many other countries, but I'm focusing on these two, have trended in that direction very strongly in the last 30 years, a sort of a neoliberal direction. A second point on the class question and class struggle and the possibility of protest, and the possibility of the subaltern rising. Remember that in the Indian case, a very sizable part of the labor force is in rural areas, who are highly dispersed and very poorly organized. The migrant labor is a huge pool, and it is indeed in the urban areas, but they tend to be footloose. They do not have local moorings. They do not have permanent attachment to Mumbai or Delhi or whatever. And in fact, in the current crisis, their first thought is to return home for very good reasons, of course, which the government has refused to understand. But nonetheless, the fact remains that migrant labor tends to be footloose, not attached to any locality. And that is a negative factor in terms of organization, protests, and a sustained ability to challenge state authority to do the right things. Now, the third point I would like to add here, in fact, a new point that I'd like to bring in, is that in a country like India, we need very much to talk about the unorganized sector, as it's called, or the informal sector. A great deal of employment in the urban areas, a very large proportion of the employment in urban areas, is not only of migrants, but also employment in the micro, small, and medium enterprises. Now, these enterprises do not have the deep pockets and the access to finance that the big corporations do. To the extent that the government has released its own purse, but especially that the central bank, namely the Reserve Bank of India, has provided additional borrowing facilities to the private sector, most of this, unfortunately, has redounded to the benefit of the large firm or formal sector. It's just unbelievable, because the large firm sector is not the source of the majority of employment in the country. It's a very small part of the employment that the large firm sector provides. And what is immediately needed is sufficient funding and finance, at least in terms of access, but ideally also in terms of the price of finance, a lowered rate of interest. That is what is immediately needed to rescue many, many small enterprises that I'm sure are in the process of dying if they are not already dead. And without that kind of a rescue operation, which will require considerable government involvement, you can't simply leave it to the private incentives of the banking system, which is what the present government is inclined to do. Unless you do that, you could face a very major crisis in terms of employment in the coming months. In fact, the Indian economy has already suffered a very substantial decline in employment, particularly in the informal sector. So yes, we need immediate planning on a war footing to take care of supply problems. We also need to come up with a very substantial, well-funded program to rescue the small firm sector in India, the informal sector, without which there could be a chronic and long-term problem of unemployment in the economy.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Actually, the last point that you mentioned is the case that is most affecting Latin American countries, such as Colombia. The small industry and informal working is the most critical part that we suffer here in Colombia. And so thank you for that. And so when it comes the dilemma that Mohan described earlier about trying to decide between the suffering caused by the disease and the suffering caused by the lockdown, Professor Ramakumar, do you think that the generational conflict that exists now in many countries could be exacerbated?
Yes, I think so. See, what many countries, I would like to supplement the point that Professor Mohan made from a slightly different angle. If you look at countries like India, what they have done is largely they have announced a small policy on how the government will spend more in the economy. It's so minuscule that it's less than 1% of the GDP. But the rest of all the announcements are regarding the use of monetary policy and not fiscal policy. They are trying to create more liquidity in the system. They're trying to make the banks be able to provide more loans, etc., etc. So basically, what they're using the monetary policy levers as a substitute for fiscal policy interventions. And that has a risk inherent in it, which is the following. Large number of households in India are already, households and companies in India are already in deep debt. Many companies big companies even have failed recently because they have not been, they've gone into defaults. NPAs, the non-performing assets of banking system, have increased significantly, and so on. Given this situation, if you're actually trying to push in more debt into the system, I doubt how sustainable that is going to be. It may be. I'm not saying no intervention is required in credit policy and monetary policy, but what you have to understand is that there is no substitute for fiscal policy sometimes in such cases. Relying on monetary policies, over-reliance on monetary policy may be a very risky strategy. If you look at, say, 2 or 3 years from now, all these loans can explode on you after a point. So the reason why your question has relevance is because the kind of fiscal policy interventions which will actually put money straight into the hands of people and increase their purchasing power and so on, that is not coming forth from the government. And that is one reason why the economic economic dimension of the crisis is likely to get exacerbated in the next few weeks, particularly among farmers, among informal sector workers in urban and rural areas, as well as the small and medium enterprises that we have. Look, the small and medium enterprises in India are different from the small and medium enterprises across the world because they are still relying largely on informal workforce. They are not on their payroll. They don't pay. They don't necessarily pay the minimum wages. They don't pay any kind of provident fund or any kinds of social security payments as part of they being part of being the payroll. So you can, in the US or in the Western countries, you can actually give a certain amount of money to a company and say you pay the wage of your workers and don't dismiss them. In India, you cannot quite implement such a policy that easily because to begin with, these workers are not in the payroll. They are like the undocumented workers in the United States. They are supposed to be not on the payroll. So there's a lot of black economy out there, unaccounted enterprises out there and workforce out there. To help them is not an easy task for the government. That is why fiscal policy becomes important in terms of universalizing the PDS, ensuring that PDS universalization is not enough. That is, food subsidy being universalized is not enough. It is also necessary that we provide more food to people through community kitchens, which some states like Kerala have done very efficiently. You need to ensure that infants, children who are between 1 and 3 years of age, are provided milk and other protein-rich food in that first 3-year period, for which you need to use what are called in India as Anganwadis, childcare centers, where you need to push all your buffer stock, which you're comfortable now. You need to use that food stock, and you should actually be able to take care of the necessities of different types of people. Universal PDS, community kitchens in every panchayat or every village, and massive supply of milk and other food items to children who are at the infant ages. You need a mix of all these things. Only then a strategy will be sort of useful in any form. Thank you.
Okay, so Professor Rao, you have something to say about this, right?
Pick up this thread because it's a very important, critical one at the current juncture. I remind you that the US has a 10% of GDP rescue package announced already in motion, and it's likely to increase further, perhaps to 15%. Japan has a package of 20%. As Ramakumar mentioned, the currently announced initiatives of the government of India amount to less than 1% of GDP. Now, there is awareness on the part of some economists that the fiscal expenditure has to increase very substantially, say of at least to the order of 5 or 6%, if not to the order of 10%. My own belief is that it should rise easily to 10% to take care of all the issues that we have been discussing today. Not just food, because that is a matter of universalizing the PDS, but especially of the question of employment via the Manrega program, about rescue plans for the MSME or the informal sector, and also direct cash transfers to the elderly, to the workers, and to the migrants, and so on. So all of this is going to cost money. And the one reason which seems to be holding up both official thinking as well as a great deal of private economists' thinking is that how is the government of India going to be able to come up with an additional financing, fiscal financing of the order of 8 or 9 or 10%, or at least 5 or 6 or 7%. I think we can consider several proposals in this regard, all of which are important. So very briefly, the first point is that states are at the front line of the COVID crisis, not the center. You may recall the debate in the United States where Trump claimed that he alone has the authority to open or shut down the economy. But of course, the states resisted, protested, and the result has been a decentralization of the decision whether to maintain the lockdown or not. Likewise, in India, the states are constrained by fiscal limits on how much they can spend. The government of India should immediately release those limits so that the states have larger spending limits and they're able to spend and organize the spending at a local level for the immediate high priority needs. So that's the first recommendation. The second recommendation is that the government of India in particular, but also private economists, need to shed their shyness about what used to be called deficit financing, or what nowadays would be called money financing. In lay terms, roughly speaking, printing money. We need to print money so that government has access to resources and is able to prioritize spending to those areas which have been severely hurt, particularly mass living standards, by the COVID crisis. Printing money is something that governments do in wartime. And if we are in a warlike situation, which I think we agree we are in, then I think we should shed our reluctance to turn on the money financing machine. But this is not a monetary policy in the ordinary sense, because it directly feeds into the fiscal space that the government has to spend on priority areas. The third recommendation is that the government of India today has a number of what I may describe as white elephant projects, projects which do not really add to the welfare of the population, certainly not in the short run, possibly also not even in the very long run. I have in mind, for example, the bullet train project connecting Ahmedabad and Mumbai. There are a number of other projects which I will not get into here. But yes, significant retrenchment of public spending, wasteful and unnecessary, or certainly not directly oriented to the well-being of the subaltern, as Sasha called them, those should be retrenched as soon as possible. And there are also longer-term fiscal issues that one might want to consider. There's been a great deal of debate in India about the reform and institution of indirect taxes, namely, in particular, the general sales tax or GST. But there's been very little discussion, in fact, zero discussion about the possibility of raising direct taxation, the tax rates on income and particularly capital gains, which mainly accrue to rich 5 or 10% of the population. By raising these direct tax rates and capital gains taxes, the government can provide itself with very ample additional funding in addition to printing money, with which the problems that we have been discussing can be addressed, as I've said repeatedly, on a war footing, because that is what is called for right now.
May I?
Yes,
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I'll just provide a few concluding remarks, because I think we are almost close to ending this. We began with the question of food security as a topic. We, like any other outbreak of an epidemic in the past, such as the Ebola epidemic of Sierra Leone, or of other epidemics in the past, or even the food price spike that we saw in 2008, all of them have resulted in great amounts of food insecurity among the hungry and vulnerable populations. This epidemic has not been different either on that front. That is, there is enormous hunger that is prevailing around us. Governments need to shed all fiscal orthodoxies, come in and use their fiscal policy instruments to spend in the economy to bring relief to people. That is extremely important at this time, number one. Number two, I would like to say that now so that's about survival. Survival is followed by revival, and revival should be followed in some sense by restoration or to normalcy. When the time of revival comes, we need to have strong economic packages for specific sectors of industries and enterprises where there is large employments involved. So which sector should get most money should be decided by the kind of benefits that it will bring to the working people who have the highest propensity to save highest propensity to spend, because they will immediately spend their wages, and it will lead to multiplier effects in the economy. That is one second important point. And when it comes to when you are on the stage of revival, we should also understand that this is the most apt and appropriate time to entrench and expand our a progressive, inclusive, universal social security system. We need a health system like the NHS in every country. In a country like India, the public health system is in shambles. This is the appropriate time to spend at least 1.5% of your GDP on the health sector, to institute a comprehensive public health system, and to move away from the current insurance-based model of public health, which we have in the country, which is largely influenced and guided by these huge luxury private hospitals that are out there, the private insurance industry, and so on. That should be discarded, and the importance of public health should be squarely brought back to table at the end of this pandemic, if at all there is an end. Now, we should ensure that there is a strong social security net, so that the poor people, working people, the elderly, women are protected by a strong social security net in the event of a similar crisis emerging in the future, which need not be an epidemic sort of a crisis. It can also be a financial crisis. It could also be a different kind of an economic crisis. So we should be prepared in some sense for that. Neoliberal policy has, over the last 30 to 40 years, consistently meticulously dismantled this social security net. We should, in some sense, that policy which existed, that consensus, may I say, which existed in the post-war period, where the role of the working class appreciated much more than it was after the 1970s and 80s, when that consensus was replaced by another consensus called the Washington Consensus. That has been disastrous to people, as we have come to realize now. Workers' movements, political movements, progressive sections of the society, this is the time for them to come out and demand a total rejection of neoliberalism in public policy and bringing back the state in many sectors, which are fundamentally important to the material conditions of life of people. That's my closing comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the term post-war consensus is very interesting to ponder at the moment, because there might also be a kind of post-virus consensus, maybe, or hopefully. The idea that I would like to mention here now is that we have sort of gotten used to economics being a kind of cult of neoliberal truisms, or we have gotten used to hearing certain economists constantly sort of preaching to the choir of what is in the interest of large corporations and banks. But I think that in a certain state of precarity that we are seeing in the global economy at the moment, there is a certain emancipatory potential, and I'm very thankful that we had now today with us two economists who have explained the different kinds of problems, but also potentialities that are part of this dynamic that we're experiencing at the moment, and the dilemma between health and economy particularly. Mr. Ramakumar has already given us his final thoughts, Mohan, if you want to make a few short closing statements, you can add to Ramakumar's sort of plea at the end, if you want to. Otherwise, we can wrap it up.
To close out our discussion today, I think we have addressed much the most important and crucial issues facing India immediately in the wake of the COVID crisis. Food ranks right at the top, but in my view, this is the easiest problem to tackle, at least for the foreseeable future, by which I mean at least the next 6 to 8 months, because we have ample stocks in the country and the Rabi harvest is coming in very soon. Food. Secondly, employment. Very little has been done by the government in this regard. And this has to be taken up, as I've said repeatedly, on a war footing. Beefing up the employment scenario, even while the lockdown is on, but especially after the lockdown ends, is extremely important. Thirdly, beefing up the safety nets, which are barely existing in India today. The right to food, the right to a basic minimum wage and employment, and a right to healthcare, universal healthcare. So not just universal food rights, but also universal health rights, plus a universal minimum income, whether through employment or through a minimum provision by the government. These three universal rights need to be instituted immediately and as part of the ways of dealing with the COVID crisis. And the last point is that we need to shed the trained incapacities, that is, beliefs which have been dinned into us as unalterable facts of life by neoliberal economics. Those are not unalterable. Those beliefs are not unalterable. I gave you one example, namely the example of the fiscal deficit and how to deal with the lack of fiscal space for the government. So there's much that can be done as part of the crisis response, but which can also be a response for a better long-term future for the country.
So, okay, Professor Ramakumar, you want to say something else?
No, I have made my closing comments, and I agree with Professor Rao that unless we transcend the neoliberal thrust of policies that we have at this point of time, any pro-people initiative will be a non-starter. Workers' movements have, in some sense, their task cut out there, and this is the most appropriate time to strike as well. The iron is hot.
Okay, so thank you both for being here, and this is a very interesting space. And thank you, Sasha and Shreya, to be here also. And thank you, everyone that are listening this podcast.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you from me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was very, very pleasurable to hear your expertise and your discussion. And thank you for joining, and bye.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Have a nice day.